regimented, disciplined, professional. The British Army of the 18th century is often described using these words, but how did a young recruit ever come to meet those standards? Much is often said of the iconic and perhaps notorious recruiting parties who would ply shepherds' sons into a lifetime of military service with the promise of adventure and good pay. But that tends to be where the popular narrative of the recruit ends. What is less often discussed and little understood is that once that man joined up, how was he actually trained? Did he go to a special boot camp like modern soldiers do? Or was he immediately thrust into the deep end with all the other soldiers with barely any preparation at all? Well, in this video, brought to you by the Native Oak and our mission to make history accessible, enjoyable, and meaningful, learn more at nativeoak.org, we're going to discuss how new recruits were introduced to the military art and made into proper soldiers. After all, the 18th century military world was a hard one, and it would only be through proper guidance that any fresh recruit could ever hope to survive, much like how genealogical research can be utterly impenetrable to the average person without the aid of this video's sponsor, MyHeritage. MyHeritage is the #1 family history service out there with an extraordinary digital archive of over 36 billion, yes, that's billion with a B, different historic records, from census data to wedding certificates, that you can easily navigate through on their platform to build up your family tree. Look here at what I was able to put together in literally just a few minutes. I only knew the names and birth dates going back to my grandparents for the most part, but I was able to plug those in, and MyHeritage's automatic matching system was able to find records almost immediately on them. I was able to confirm certain information, add it to the tree, get more matches, more names, more dates, and I was able to figure out birthplaces, occupations, even burial places for generations that I had previously known close to nothing at all about. For example, I learned about how my great-great-grandfather Wulf was born in Galicia in Austria and apparently immigrated to the United States in 1913. I had known it was something vaguely Eastern European and that he migrated before the First World War. I had no idea just how close cut he made it there. That was in the nick of time, I gotta say. I found out that, of course, his first language was Yiddish, and when he was in the United States, he was apparently working as a janitor to maintain his household of 4. Now, going back further than Wulf is definitely going to be trickier, considering that, his parents were presumably in Austria at the time. But, with literally billions of records to explore and all these amazing automatic matching tools, well, I know that there's going to be something out there about them. It's really just a matter of putting in a little bit of extra time and looking for them. In short, MyHeritage makes it quicker and easier than ever before to build up your family tree and to connect with your roots, especially with their Instant Discoveries feature that allows you to add entire branches to your family tree with just a single click. You can also use it to colorize, repair, even animate historic photographs, helping to make your family history feel more personal in a really unique and moving way, or, just colorize fun historic photographs, as I like to do too. It's a great tool, and it's a lot of fun, so if you're interested in genealogical research like I've been wanting to do for the longest time, and you'd like to give it a shot yourself, you can follow the link in the description down below, where you'll get a 14-day free trial to their service. Thank you so much to MyHeritage for their generous sponsorship of this video, and now, let's move on to the topic at hand. As with so many elements of early modern military life, the recruitment and training of new soldiers was not actually handled by the army itself, but instead by its constituent regiments. When a man enlisted, he didn't join the British Army as a vague, nondescript whole, so much as he enlisted to a specific regiment. Now, if you're wondering what a regiment actually is, I have a video on that subject that you might want to watch, which I'll link down below. Suffice to say, it was the core organizational unit of the Army back then, as it still remains very important to British Army organization to this day. And for most of the 18th century, it typically consisted of a few hundred men, on very rare occasions, a little over 1,000. In any case, it was up to regimental officers to handle their own recruitment, and when a man took up the king's shilling, he would immediately be joined to that regiment as a private soldier. There were no boot camps, nor were there any state-appointed drill instructors, or much at all by way of formal necessary qualifications. It'd be up to the individual regiment to ensure that their recruits were up to the standard, which for the most part, they themselves would set. The quality and extent of the training then would also vary by regiment depending on how well that regiment was being run. So moving forward in this video, it's important to understand that everything I say is going to be a very broad generalization. The sources that I'm pulling from are primarily military treatises that were written towards the end of the 18th century, and which were written as prescriptive texts for how their authors, writing for a military audience, thought it was best to handle the issues in question. They were not necessarily perfect descriptions of what was actually happening on the ground, so take this video as an introduction to the topic at hand and not the conclusion of your research. If you'd like to read any of the books that I reference in this video, or many others besides, you'll find them all posted totally for free in the digital library over at nativeoak.org. So contextual disclaimers aside, we can begin by pulling up everyone's favorite, The Interior Economy of a Battalion of Infantry by Bennett Cuthbertson, where he describes something that may come as a little surprise in that once a recruiting party returns to their regiment with all the fresh blood, it was important that the new recruit be treated with a certain level of leniency and not actually be inspected or otherwise put through any paces until having at least had that same day and the night to rest. The fatigue of a march, to which the recruit has probably been much unaccustomed, he describes, generally reduces his size and alters his appearance in such a manner that a night's rest scarcely recovers him. It would therefore be an injustice to the officer who enlisted him not to be allowed so trifling an indulgence. After that period of rest, then, the recruits would be inspected to ensure their fitness for service by the commanding officer, and thence divided between the different battalion companies. A recruit should never be assigned, incidentally, to a flank company, i.e. the light infantry or the grenadiers, because preferably they're only ever going to be veteran soldiers. And Cuthbertson goes into rather exacting detail over that process if you'd like to learn more about how men were assigned to whatever company they were going to wind up in. To put it simply, there was usually a rota between the different companies for their officers to choose which recruits they wanted, while men could also be traded between the companies to ensure that they all remained on more or less equal footing. Cuthbertson also stresses that in the early days of a recruit's training, it was particularly important that they not be housed all together, but instead are billeted with older and more experienced soldiers so that they could immediately begin to learn from them. Similarly, it was vital that NCOs keep a keen eye out for the recruit, ensure that he was treated kindly by his messmates, and that they do not endeavor to impose on him, as such attention in his favor will give him an early liking for the Corps. Once the recruit had been rested a bit and assigned to his company and squad of inspection, he would be instructed in how to dress in his new army clothes, how to maintain them, as well as certain niceties like how to salute and when. But of course, the true start to his military career would be his introduction to drilling. Now, of course, the recruit wouldn't just be handed a musket and thrown into the line. Oh, no. He had to start with the basics first. And I do mean the very basic, beginning with how to stand. The first thing necessary to be taught them, says Thomas Symes in his Military Instructor for NCOs and Privates, is to give them the air and dress of a soldier in order to drive out the clown, to set them well upon their limbs, etc., agreeable to the position of a soldier under arms. Which is both a metaphorical social position, of course, but also a very literal one in the manual exercise. It's the first position to be learned by every soldier, and is the basis for all of his movements. It's more or less their version of standing at attention. And Cuthbertson agrees in this, writing, "The first thing to be done in training young soldiers is to give them a free and easy carriage, to set them well upon their limbs, and totally to expel the clown from their gait and air. It must be rendered familiar to every man to hold up his head, to stand quite upright and motionless, to cast his eyes to the right without the least appearance of a formal stiffness, and to turn out his toes." In fact, Cuthbertson even specifies an exercise to ensure that the men retain their proper posture. When a recruit does not readily throw back his shoulders, without which he can never acquire the air of a soldier, he must be obliged to stand some hours in a day with his hands behind his back, holding the joints of his elbows, which will in a little time draw them to a proper position, and of course get up his head. Once the man has been taught to properly stand, then it would come time to learn how to walk, or more properly, how to march. Again to Symes. Secondly, they are to be taught the military step, in order to give them a free and easy carriage, which can only be acquired by practice of marching quick or slow in regular order. It is of consequence on the march, or in the line, that they keep their ranks well dressed, for men who march in an irregular manner, or are not drawn in a straight line and the files covered, are in disorder, and if fallen upon by an enemy, must be defeated. Once again, Cuthbertson agrees in much the same language, continuing that the recruit must learn to march firm upon his feet, keeping his knees stiff, turning out and pointing his toes at the same time, to keep his body straight without leaning backwards or pushing out his belly, to bring forward his chest and to draw his shoulders back, to face to the right and left and quite about, both standing and marching, to wheel in a proper manner, and to march in slow and quick time, in all of which recruits should be perfectly instructed and well trained before they are allowed to touch a firelock. Note that through all of this, not only are the men being drilled without their muskets, but some theorists, like David Dundas in his Principles of Military Movements, also advised against the use of drums, because the timing of these movements all needed to be perfectly internalized without their presence. He even argues actually a bit against the way drums were used in battle itself, but that's a discussion for another video. Regardless of their use in training and in combat, the drums still played, of course, a vastly more important role in the day-to-day management of a military encampment, and memorizing their various signals and calls would have been vital for any recruit. As such, Symes dictated that after every drill session, the men should be instructed in the sounds and beatings of the drum, including memorizing the sound of the assembly, of the marching cadences, reveille, the trooping, the tap-two, to arms, retreat, parley, and chamade, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but you get the point. Now, returning to the drill itself, once all of those basics were covered, indeed the men would finally be given their firelocks. But of course, by no means would they actually be firing them. Instead, they would be given their arms and accoutrements, and alongside being taught how to maintain and clean it all, including how to remove the locks from their muskets, all of which Symes goes into great detail on how to do, well, they would once again be put basically through all of those same paces, how to stand, how to walk, just with all of the extra gear, until the musket seems to rest with perfect ease against the shoulder, as Cuthbertson describes. Otherwise, they will never be brought to a graceful and dexterous manner of performing the exercise. Once that level of grace has been achieved in thus carrying the musket, they could then go through the full exercise, what we today might call drill. Basically, they'd learn all the different positions of carrying the musket, of fixing bayonets, rendering honors, and the motions necessary to go between all of those positions. Then, and only then, could they begin to learn the firings. Not that they'd actually be shooting anything, of course, because first they'd be going through dry fire exercises, with the recruits simply going through all the motions without using actual ammunition. Then they could promote to blank firing, which Cuthbertson actually describes as being a bigger deal than what we might expect. As soon as a recruit is master of all the motions in the manual and platoon exercise, he must be trained in the use of powder, to which most of them have at first that aversion which may be reasonably expected in ignorant, unexperienced peasants, whose heads are filled with the most dreadful apprehensions of its effects from the stories told them out of fun by the old soldiers. It requires some practice to get the better of this dislike, and to prevail upon them to load with coolness, nor is it thoroughly effected until they fire with ball, which should as soon as possible be done, as by that they become assured their former fears were groundless. Cuthbertson specifically emphasized that the men be taught how to load and fire in every rank, front rank, center, rear, regardless of where they would normally be placed by virtue of their size, owing to natural exigencies of the service and, of course, combat, which might alter their position in the ranks with very little warning. And indeed, as he says, once the men were accustomed to firing with blank rounds, just the powder, no ball, and they're not afraid of the guns blowing up in their faces, they could then be promoted to live rounds, with an emphasis in the British Army not merely on firing rapidly, but accurately as well. It's a common misconception that men with muskets wouldn't even bother to aim, but in fact, musketry was far more accurate than we typically give it credit for, and firing at marks, marksmanship practice, was an important part of British military training, which I have 2 videos about already if you'd like to learn more. Again, they're linked below. Symes specifically mentions that the most important things when it comes to firing were ensuring that the men knew how to fix their flints to procure the most fire, where fire is certain, after all, it generally kills, and that the men took good aim. The manual exercise itself specifies that men close one eye and look down the barrel along their musket's sight. Indeed, muskets did have a sight at the end of the barrel that the men could use to aim. And that was a very important part of knowing how to use the musket, not just leveling it in a direction, but actually picking out what you're going to be shooting at. So at long last, the recruit, having been taught how to stand and how to march, how to toss his musket and to take well-aimed shots, and of course to properly maintain all of his equipment, he is finally starting to cut a soldierly appearance. And then it came time for another major step, his performing all of these tasks while in ranks, because most of the training in those earlier days is largely either individual or it's being done at a very open order with other recruits. Typically, his drill would be led by either a drill corporal or a drill sergeant, with an experienced soldier to act as their fugleman. The exact roles and qualifications for those individuals we'll cover in a future video. At last then, ready for close order action, the recruits could be joined in with the other soldiers for whatever larger scale maneuvers they needed to practice, particularly in sub and grand divisions, battalions, and even full brigades, which might see the men wheeling, marching obliquely, going from lines into columns and back again, forming square, engaging in street firings, and many other movements which all need a large body of men in order to properly train. But of course, even as these men are now training with all of the other soldiers and are no longer just treated as recruits, the basics would never be forgotten. The life of a soldier in the early modern era was very much a one of continual drill, and these basic building blocks would be reinforced more or less every day through regular inspections and morning parades, the day-to-day posting of sentries, and of course just outright drilling for its own sake. That all came then between other duties like cooking rations and cleaning, fetching water and wood, establishing camps, cleaning, maintaining equipment, building fortifications, cleaning, and every variety of fatigue, all of which, rather than following any kind of formal training patterns, would largely be done by picking up the ways of a soldier from the older men who could guide them, and of course also by the NCOs who were placed over them in their squads of inspection. Overall, the life of a recruit was very much a learning-on-the-job kind of situation. There were no boot camps, nor were there any specific strength or endurance exercises that were intended to prepare the men for these tasks. There was no drop and give me 20 or run a mile in a certain amount of time. Instead, it was mostly just going through the drill itself over and over again, and otherwise just living the life of a soldier. The training for a task was the task itself, just with ever-increasing levels of complexity until a complete mastery of those tasks was had. The only real question then, and the points that men like Cuthbertson and Symes, as well as others like the Earl of Cavan, David Dundas, Thomas Hindle, the only thing that they're really talking about then is just how that drill was to be conducted, by whom, and in what order and intensity. Again, if you'd like to read more on this topic, because truly all of the information in this video is really just the bare minimum introduction, well, you will find hours worth of reading about this and far more, all for free by visiting the digital library at nativeoak.org, to say nothing of how my channel, likewise, has hours worth of content to explore. For example, if you want to learn more about squads of inspection, how they worked, or the different ranks of NCOs and officers and the like and their responsibilities, I have videos on all of those topics. So like I said, I think that the next video I make is going to be about 18th century drill instructors, but for now, I shall bid my farewell. Thank you all so much for your time today, and also special thanks to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. Remember that you can unlock the amazing stories of your family history like never before by following the link below and signing up for a 14-day free trial. You know, supporting the sponsors supports the channel and all that stuff. Thank you also, of course, to this channel's direct contributors on Patreon, because it is your generosity that has allowed me to come so far, and I am truly immensely grateful for that. We have hit 250,000 subscribers, my friends, so here's to 250 more, while of course I am and I shall ever remain your most humble and obedient of servants.